Greetings, my friends. I'm glad that it took a lot to get us here, but we are here. My friends, I want to welcome everybody to the maiden voyage of Let's Be Clear. And that's going to be a podcast where we're going to do some different stuff. We are really going to get into issues and we're going to fight against fuzzy thinking. But let me start with a story. Let me start with a political story. I'm going to show you I'm a different type of politician, and I'm going to prove it right now. There was a talk show host who was interviewing a politician, and the politician was just throwing him. The talk show host couldn't get on first base. The politician was just all over the place, and the talk show host it got exasperated and said, you know what? We're going to start this all over. We're going to give you one question, and we're going to ask the simplest question, and that will get everything to go in a positive way, and from then on we'll have understanding. And the talk show host looked at the politician, looked him in the eye, and said, sir, here's a simple question. What is your favorite color? Without blinking an eye, the politician looked him in the eye and said, plaid. So, my friends, this is what we are fighting against on this show. We're fighting against plaid answers. We're fighting against fuzzy thinking. We're fighting against stuff that doesn't make sense, nonsense, doesn't even make good nonsense. We're not going to have plaid answers on this show. We are the antidote. Let's be clear. And with that, we're going to take some of the hardest subjects. We're going to find folk who are for it. We're going to find folk who are against it. And we're going to debate it in the best way possible. And to show you that we're not scared, let's take the hardest subjects. Let's take the hardest ones first. Let's talk $16 billion deficit. Oh, yes. New York State is $16 billion in the hole, meaning that we have to figure out who gets cut. Is it going to be the social safety net? Is it going to be the working class? Or is there another way that we can get some money to do this? And one suggestion has been what some people call the 1%. Some people say that we can get from a stock transfer tax, and we can make sure, bless you, and we can make sure, interactive, my friends, interactive, that we meet the needs of New York State. So we're going to have some people, and we're going to have we're going to go into this, and we're going to have Assemblyman Phil Steck. He's going to speak about this. We're going to follow that up with Michael Kink, and we're hoping to get David Friedfeld on here because David thinks that this is a terrible idea. So we'll wait, and I think that Assemblyman Fink and Steck rather and Kink may have ambushed poor David and made sure that he couldn't show up. Perhaps David will be able to untie himself before then and get to the show. If not, in such a saintly assemblage, the devil needs an advocate. I will be the devil's advocate. Gentlemen, I'm a tough one. You will see my inner conservative come out on this one. Pray that David gets here because he will be an easier guy than I am. But enough of that. Assemblyman Phil Steck. Now you've got 2 minutes to do the impossible. You got to introduce yourself. You've got to say what we're here to talk about and say where you stand, and then we're going to turn it over to Michael. Assemblyman, I'm glad to see you here, or at least virtually.
Thank you, Senator. So I'm an assemblyman from Albany and Schenectady counties. The stock transfer tax was instituted by the Republican Party way back in 1905. Republicans favored sales tax as opposed to income and property tax. It existed until 1981. In the late 70s, the proceeds of the stock transfer tax were diverted to bailing New York City out of its financial crisis. And then when that financial crisis came to an end, the mayor of New York at the time, Abraham Beame, persuaded Governor Carey that it was no longer needed. So it was fundamentally phased out. The tax is 1/4% in general terms. Under current calculations, in the month of June, it would have raised $1.6 billion alone because of extremely high volume of trading in New York City. And so projections for this year could range anywhere from 12 billion to 19 billion if it had been in effect. I can certainly come back at a later time to the refuting the arguments against the tax, but suffice it to say, I'll just leave with this because I only have 2 minutes. I don't want to overrun my time, that this tax is in effect everywhere in the world that there are stock exchanges. Europe the European Parliament just voted to impose a similar tax. It's been in effect in London since 1800. So, and the London Stock Exchange is not going to show any signs of moving to Dublin, Ireland, because this tax exists. So the main thing about New York is New York has the highest volume of trading anywhere in the world. And so the transaction costs in New York are very low, and the small stock transfer tax would not deter anybody from continuing to participate in stock transfers in New York State.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see we've been joined by David Friedfeld. Sir, I was scared that Michael Kink and Phil Steck had ambushed you and made sure that you were tied up somewhere, but I'm glad that they can't keep a good man down, that you slipped your bounds, and that you are here. Right after Michael Kink speaks, Michael's gonna speak for 2 minutes, just giving a general, and then we are going to hear from you, and then we're gonna have some fun. We're going to truly debate an issue. And Michael, would you be kind enough to take it from there, sir?
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator Sanders. And thank you, Mr. Steck. Mr. Steck kind of did the beginning and the end of the stock transfer tax, started by Republicans in 1905 to increase the burden on rich Wall Street traders and decrease the burden on working class homeowners. Ended in 1981 by David Rockefeller, who was the chair of Chase Manhattan Bank at that time, leaning on both Abe Beame and Hugh Carey to force austerity cuts to public services. But in the middle, the stock transfer tax helped fund the broadest period of shared prosperity in New York history. The stock transfer tax helped build the CUNY and SUNY systems at very low or free tuition. People in New York could get a free higher education of the highest quality in the country, paid for by a small sales tax on Wall Street stock trades. We built the Housing Authority, which in its heyday was a beautiful, large-scale social experiment in helping people from all kinds of backgrounds, working class people and poor people, live together and step up the economic ladder towards their own homes and their own home ownership. We built the Mitchell-Lama program, which is probably one of the most beloved housing programs in New York. Still houses hundreds of thousands of middle-class, working-class people, seniors, and the stock transfer tax can fund those types of investments now. The mistake New York made is that we gave all the power to the Wall Street traders, lawyers, bankers, real estate moguls, instead of having the confidence that the people of New York and their representatives in government could chart a path forward. What we've seen for the last 20, 30 years is the rich people on Wall Street in charge. And what we've seen is the worst inequality of any state in the nation. We've seen rich people getting richer, and we've seen everyone else struggling and going backwards. We've seen Wall Street elite shifting the burden away from themselves onto people that need to pay high property taxes on their homes or high sales taxes on a cup of coffee. If a working person pays a sales tax on a cup of coffee at the bodega, then a high rolling stock trader on Wall Street should pay a sales tax on his flash trades. And that's the essential fairness of what we're talking about here. Taking control of the state's revenue sources back for the broad populace, taking it away from a tiny elite that's getting richer and richer, and making the investments that can lead to broad prosperity for all New Yorkers, not just more riches for a tiny few.
Well put, sir. And I'm sure, Mr. Friedfeld, you agree totally with everything has been said. So I guess you're just going to say amen and raise the tax.
Well, that would make for a pretty boring podcast, and I'm sure that you don't want that. So I thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And sorry about that technical delay there. So I think there are a couple of things to kind of remember and bring into the conversation. One is the importance of the security industry to New York State and to New York State's coffers, to how much they pay in taxes there. As according to the Comptroller's report, they're responsible for about 17% of state tax collections. That'd be about $14 billion and 6% of city tax collections. And I mentioned that $13.6 billion because it's particularly important because that's, kind of roughly how much some of the estimates on the stock transfer tax would be. So it'd be essentially doubling the taxation on the securities industry. And another thing to remember is that while New York is still dominant in the industry, New York's employment is about 4% smaller in New York City now than it was before the 2007 to 2009 recession. But nationally, employment has actually recovered back to the pre-recession levels. So while New York is dominant, we're not as dominant as we used to be. And it's important to keep that in mind because of how much they contribute in tax revenue and employment in general and the economy for the state overall, that they are an important employer in the state. And I think another thing to really keep in mind when it comes to discussions about restoring the tax is that a lot has changed since the tax was repealed. When in 1981, and certainly before that, in those periods where the stock transfer tax was in effect, you really kind of had to be at one of the major stock exchanges in the world in order to be involved in the securities industry. That's really not the case any longer. You can initiate trades and be involved in the industry anywhere in the world electronically. And at the same time, the processors, the way that the trades actually take place, they're located outside of New York. And the stock exchange is owned by an international company that owns exchanges throughout the world, in Canada, throughout the US, and in Europe as well. I'm not sure if I'm over my 2 minutes there, but it's kind of a few points I wanted to bring into the conversation.
Well put, sir. We let the record show that I'm always going to give Mr. Friedfeld a little bit more time than anybody else, because when you got two folk who are for something, we're going to make it as fair as we can. So having said that, Assembly Member Steck, what is this STT bill and how will it help the state assembly? What is this thing that we're speaking about? What is a stock transfer tax, and is there a bill? What's going on, sir? Why don't you let everyday people know what's going on?
So what we did when we first introduced this bill was we're putting the proceeds into infrastructure. The infrastructure of the state is in steep decline. Senator, you and I talked about where the money should go to make sure that all parts of our state got a fair share of it. And the idea was, unfortunately, the economy of Wall Street that's very, very successful certainly doesn't benefit a lot of people up where I live or throughout upstate New York. We also have serious crises with the MTA and with the New York City Housing Authority. Another thing that we did with that money was we have this bill to, it's called the Climate Leadership Act, and we're supposed to be fossil fuel free by 2040. However, it is completely unfunded. Everybody always says, oh, global warming is a terrible thing, we ought to do something about it. But the bottom line is that you have to invest in green infrastructure, and we put 15% of the money raised into that. Well, then the COVID crisis came around, and what we decided was we needed the money to fill the budget gap that currently exists. And so we decided to put all the money into the general fund until 2 years had passed, and then under the bill it would go to the distribution that was originally planned. So
how much is the budget shortfall?
well, you quoted 16 billion. I think it's growing. One of the things that the governor is doing is putting off he's putting off the day of reckoning, and he has to allow certain expenditures to be made. And every time you do that without raising revenue to offset those expenditures, you are making the deficit worse and worse. Of course, there is some money available in terms of the governor's regional economic development councils, but that would be persuading the governor to give up, you know, his one of his biggest pet programs. I think that would be difficult, but money could be obtained from that area as well. But we're looking at, you know, the number I've seen is $15 billion a year over 4 years. But again, as I pointed out, it's getting worse.
All right. So, Mr. Kink, so by now you have been made aware of David's position, and you've switched your position, I've been told. Is this true?
It is not true, Senator Sanders. The thing I think listeners need to do is to put both the budget gap and the stock transfer tax in context. New York's economy is huge. The gross domestic product of New York State is $1.73 trillion, trillion with a T. The New York State economy is bigger than the Russian economy. It's bigger than the South Korean economy. It's bigger than the Canadian economy. Our per capita gross domestic product is bigger than Sweden or Denmark or the Netherlands. So our state is not broke. Our state has huge amounts of wealth and income. And what's happening now is that a small number of people are taking all the wealth and income for themselves. You've seen, particularly after the pandemic, this K-shaped economy where there's a small number of people whose wealth and income is skyrocketing. You know, many of them sit on the board of the Citizens Budget Commission, and many of them are the people that are saying, oh, we got to cut the schools. We got to cut the healthcare. We got to push more people into homelessness and poverty. We can't help tenants that are struggling to pay the rent. We just got to keep letting rich people get richer. And that is exactly the wrong thing to do. We already have 3 million people on unemployment in New York. Our economy will work better if we help 19.5 million New Yorkers, everybody, instead of just 120 billionaires or 46,000 multimillionaires, right? We have to look at the whole picture of the state. And that's why the stock transfer tax is so effective and so important. It zeroes in on one of the places where speculation is exploding, where wealth is exploding. And both Mr. Steck and David and I can struggle around with how you pay, who pays, but they told us that they'd leave in 1905, and they didn't leave. They told us that the stock transfer tax would be outlawed when the telephone came into effect and people used stock trades on telephones. None of that happened, right? Rich people on Wall Street, literally working through the Citizens Budget Commission since 1932, have been explicitly saying, don't tax rich people, only cut poor people and working people. And what we have now in Albany is a chance to take control back for regular people. We don't have to give control to the rich. We don't have to give control to the billionaires. We need to take back control for regular people and make the decisions that benefit everyone. And it is absolutely time for the wealthy to pay. You know, there are governors in other states, Phil Murphy, Gavin Newsom, J.B. Pritzker, who are calling on the wealthiest in their states to contribute during this time of crisis. The idea that billionaires can say, no, cut the schools and cut the nurses and cut the firefighters, don't ask us to pay a little bit more in taxes, is ridiculous. It's immoral. That position is wrong. It's morally wrong. And it is certainly economically wrong. Because if you're talking about laying off hundreds of thousands of more teachers and firefighters and nurses to protect a small handful of stock traders on Wall Street, you should not be in the position you're in. I think our state needs to take a clearer vision, as you said in this podcast on our standards. We need to look at the policies that will benefit everyone, not just the super rich.
So let me get this right, Mr. Freefeld. Handful of billionaires versus just about everybody else. And if these guys, if I just take the belief of Mr. Kink and Mr. Steck, are we just giving it all to the billionaires? Is there more to this question, or is it as simple as it has been described, sir?
I think there's a lot more to the question, and there's a lot more to the CBC than what Mr. Kink had described. So I'm going to try not to address those attacks on my organization, but when it comes to the wealthy paying in New York State, the top 1% of personal income tax filers are responsible for 40% of the payments. Now, they're responsible for a lot of the wealth, but they are responsible for 40% of the payments. So they are paying a lot. And when it comes to the other states and the level of progressivity in their state income tax systems, New York State, when combined with New York City's rate, and New York State is really alone in having a significant local tax rate on top of a significant state tax rate. The combined rate is the second highest in the country, behind only California. Recently, New Jersey, they didn't actually increase their rate. What they did was they lowered the threshold where the top rate kicked in at 10.75%. The state's top combined rate with New York City is 12.7%. So it's 2 full percentage points higher than what it is in New Jersey. New York also has lots of elements built into the personal income tax system that make it so that the wealthy pay more than they do in other states. And that's not a bad thing, because they make a lot of money and they contribute a lot. The state should do a much better job of putting more of that money into reserves, so that when we do have economic downturns and wealthy people's income varies quite a bit when the economy goes down, we don't have nearly enough in reserves as we should, so that we don't have to cut services. I took some notes as we're going along. And while there is still a tremendous amount of wealth in New York State, the state government is broke. The impacts of this recession are truly severe on the state's coffers. The current year gap is about $8 billion that still needs to be cut according to the financial plan. They say it's going to be cut in aid to localities, which could be very drastic and draconian, and the state should not be going that route. And then in next year, the gap is looking closer to $17 billion when I look at the financial plan. So these are really significant gaps that need to have a really serious and important view in order to close those gaps in the future without having either cuts that really hurt the neediest among us, or I hope everyone would agree that at a certain level, if you increase taxes, if you continue to increase taxes, it will have a negative impact and people will leave. I mean, we do see that people respond to financial stimulus. The idea that you can raise taxes, forever and not have an impact, I think we would all agree is just not an accurate reflection of the way that people respond to financial incentives.
Well, by the powers invested in me, I'm making you a temporary legislator, David. You are now, that drink that you're taking is the Kool-Aid that we've been drinking up here somehow. You are a temporary legislator. How would you solve the budget problem?
Well, I think for this year's gap, there are a number of things the state can do, and we released a report on this. It included, Michael had talked about, cutting schools. We have done an extensive analysis showing that the state school aid formulas provide way too much money to wealthy school districts. So we think you can save some money there, about $800 million. Then looking at the state's capital program, the state currently intends to finance about $4 billion worth of capital investments using cash on hand as opposed to issuing debt. Issuing debt to pay for capital is a perfectly appropriate financial mechanism that can save you close to $4 billion. The other big chunk is accessing some of the state's reserves. The state has, about $5.5 billion amongst its various reserves. To close kind of the rest of the gap, the state could look to use some of that this year, and also, reserving some for future years. And going forward, the state owns a lot of assets that, thinking about, don't make a lot of sense. The New York State owns 19 golf courses, including many in some of the wealthiest parts of Long Island, which to me, selling that real estate could be, particularly depending on which courses they sold, the state can make a lot of money. And that's an area where they should really look to help to raise some revenue to help close the gaps.
Make sure that you get my office a copy of that report, sir.
I'd be happy to.
I would like that. Now, Assemblyman, you have your work cut out. Mr. Freefeld has really made a very decent case. How do you refute this, sir?
Well, first of all, I think there's a lot that he said that just is not accurate. His vision of the stock transfer tax is about 40 years out of date. He claims to be modern, but in fact, he's going backwards. His vision that people can trade anywhere in the world, which is certainly true, is based on an old legal concept that the trade had to physically happen in New York in order to be taxable here. That is not the case. It doesn't matter if the computers executing those trades are in Bora Bora. As long as the firms arranging the trades are in New York, it is taxable here under the Supreme Court's Wayfair decision, because the courts have had to take notice of how the internet works. So that is not accurate. The second thing is that New Jersey, for example, had all the computer farms located in New Jersey that were processing these trades. New York's jurisdiction is not based on computer farms. It's based on the fact that the firms are located here and arranging transactions that go through New York. So I think also one of the things that, anybody can threaten to leave at any time, but this is a function of very basic economics. It's a cost-benefit analysis. And when we take any type of sales tax, if I go to the store and the government taxes my product at a 30% rate, I'm not going to buy that product, and therefore the merchant is going to be injured. But if the tax rate is so low that the consumer continues to buy, which is the way it's done all over the world at exchanges that have these taxes, they put them at very low rates, similar to what is in our legislation, there's absolutely no effect on the merchant. And quite frankly, New York has a tremendous advantage. The volume in New York it's even 5 times or more than in all of Europe. And when you are in a high volume situation with low transaction fees, the addition of a very small percentage tax makes no difference whatsoever. People continue to still benefit from trading in New York. There are many other benefits from trading in New York, including being associated with the same people with the same economic interests that you have. So I don't think the arguments here that are being made have much validity. I did want to point out today that, as Professor Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, pointed out in our panel discussion, and many others, it's a different era. 80% of the trades now are algorithmic. They are not trading for long-term investment. When John Maynard Keynes proposed this tax way back in the 20s and 30s, he was concerned about the casino aspect of stock transfers as opposed to encouraging investment, which is what we should be doing. So from an economic standpoint, the only people who might be hurt by this are day traders. And yeah, that's a significant number of trades, but all the studies have shown that Wall Street employment is not at all dependent on this sort of thing, on transaction costs, which is what the stock transfer tax would add an infinitesimal amount to. It is dependent on broader trends in the economy and in the securities industry itself. So I think what we're dealing here, I love to quote my favorite president, Franklin Roosevelt, who had a very different economic point of view, a Keynesian economic point of view, where it was the people at the bottom having the aggregate demand of people at the bottom having the resources to buy products in the economy that drove the economy forward. But we have to return to recognizing the principles of Keynesian economics, not this concept that every tax is bad. Ronald Reagan, we're going to build the shining city on the hill, but how to pay for it is never discussed. We're trying to do something to make this a better state. We're looking at this tax from an economic standpoint. It would cost these firms far more to move to avoid a tax they don't even pay. They don't pay the tax. The tax is paid by investors. And again, some of whom are principals in these firms, it's true. But on the whole, the tax is paid by investors as long as it is small enough. It is just like my example of the basic store tax. People are not deterred by continuing their behavior by an extremely small sales tax. That is the principle of all sales taxes.
Well, that sounds good. So, Mr. Friedfeld, I'll get back to you. A few pennies are going to make the billionaires run to where do they run? I don't know. I don't know any billionaires.
That makes two of us. I think I just kind of want to address something that the Assemblyman had said, and that's I agree that it is a cost-benefit analysis, and that certainly a very small tax or fee is not going to drive everyone out of New York. The issue, and I think there's a few issues. One of them relates to kind of how much revenue will actually come in. So the current tax is not. It's on the books, but it's not actually rebated in the way I think most people would think about it. The revenue is not actually collected and then sent back out. The revenue never actually touches state coffers. There's a third-party entity that administers this on behalf of the stock exchange as well as NASDAQ. So the money's never laid out. So because of that reason, I think a lot of trades are being recorded as taxable when they may not be, because there's no real incentive to go through the efforts to make a trade not taxable. So it's just easier to just have it go through that process. And specific as it relates to the Wayfair decision, I've read it a few times, and I certainly understand the applicability to sales and use tax, which was always liable. If you're a New Yorker and you bought a pair of jeans online and got delivered into New York, that was actually always taxable. Even if the vendor didn't collect it for you, it was actually subject to use tax. It was always collectible. And Wayfair is saying that the state can make those third-party entities collect the tax for the state. But when it comes to stock transfer tax, I think it's a little different. Specifically, if let's say you live in New Jersey and you're buying a stock through your broker who's in New Jersey, and it goes to those computer servers that are located in New Jersey, never going through the New York Stock Exchange floor, I'm not sure that that's a taxable event. And I believe it's probably not a taxable event. but it's likely still being recorded as a taxable event.
Mr. Kink, why don't you take it from there? What's your position? You've heard a bunch of stuff.
Well, I think it's important to note that tax cuts on the rich are 5 times better for the economy than budget cuts for everybody else.
Why is that?
Well, it's the multiplier effect. Temporary legislator Friedfeld just announced he wants to cut 300,000 jobs in the middle of a recession, right?
I did not say that.
You proposed cutting $4 billion in infrastructure spending. The usual
I said they should fund it
per $1 billion, you get 75,000 jobs, and therefore you're cutting 300,000 jobs in the middle of a recession, right? That's what.
That's not what I said. You misunderstood what I said.
They want to cut jobs. They want to cut schools. They don't want to tax Wall Street. If we tax Wall Street to make the investments to build our economy, to build green infrastructure, to build better schools for all students, rich and poor, then we're making the investments in New York's future that we need. So in a very difficult situation, the state has decisions to make. Are we going to hurt the people that are already hurting? Or are we going to ask the people that are getting richer and richer to pay a little bit more? I think the stock transfer tax is an important part of a component of revenue items that could bring real resources to the state and allow us to build back stronger than we were before, right? COVID demonstrated the profound inequalities in our state. Huge amounts of deaths across Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx. Almost no deaths on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The actual public health infrastructure in our state has been decimated by decades of disinvestment. And what we've been doing during those decades is giving money back to Wall Street traders, right? The flash traders, the algorithmic traders, the people that do the highest volume. Ken Griffin, who just bought the $238 million apartment on Billionaires Row. He's a flash trader. He's the guy that would pay a lot of sales tax. He moves in and out of stocks in seconds, and he puts his servers right next to the New York Stock Exchange servers, so he has an extra advantage front running the stocks in ways that may or may not be legal. This kind of trade will reduce the explosion of inequality in New York. This kind of tax can provide real resources to invest in our future. And if you combine it with a billionaire's tax, if you combine it with an ultra millionaire's tax on the very wealthy, if you make private equity companies pay a mortgage recording tax when they buy huge numbers of apartments, just like working people have to pay a mortgage recording tax when they buy a house or an apartment, those sorts of measures can provide the money to not only fill our budget gap, but to invest in jobs, to invest in addressing our economic, social, and racial inequality. And the Wall Street lobbyists won't tell you about addressing any of that. They just want to protect their money and they want to push the cuts onto everybody else. And this is not a state where Wall Street lobbyists should be in charge. This is a state where the people should be in charge. And this tax, the stock transfers tax, the Sanders Steck tax, is one measure to get us there.
I must admit that my district was the second hardest hit in the nation with COVID-19. And all that means is we did the second largest amount of dying in the nation. So your words have much relevance to me. Now, Mr. Friedfeld, have you been mischaracterized? I think that you believe that somehow your words have come back to you in a manner that you did not send them out. Is that true, sir?
It is. I mean, and it's Friedfeld.
Friedfeld. I stand corrected again. I was scared. I was moving.
That's no problem. Particularly when it comes to the capital piece of what our report said, it had to do with how those investments were being financed. Right now, the state was going to use cash for that. We think they should use that for budget relief and finance those investments by issuing debt, which is something, it has nothing to, it have no impact on how much is spent in the current years, or it would require debt financing in the future. That was kind of the main takeaway. And as far as the school aid cuts to wealthy districts, CBC has said that for a while. And if those local districts want to raise their local property taxes to do that, those wealthy districts, then that's kind of a different question. But the state shouldn't be sending excessive amounts of school aid to wealthy school districts when there are high need school districts in New York State that do not have enough money to provide a sound basic education.
Now, Mr. Friedfeld, when you speak of debt financing, isn't debt financing just putting, kicking the ball down the road and putting the weight on future generations?
When it comes to operating, that's certainly a fair classification. When it comes to capital investments, if you're making truly a capital investment, that's something where the debt can really only be issued for the useful life of that investment. So you're building a bridge that's going to be used for 30 years. You issue bonds for 30 years. Then the users of that bridge are paying for it over the course of that period.
Mr. Steck, Assembly member, I'll allow you to unmute yourself and get back into the conversation. Is there any point that you have picked up on in the conversation?
Yes, I apologize. I had someone stop in my office with an urgent request. So I want to address the school.
It wasn't the day traders coming to tell you to change your vote.
Oh, I've had young kids coming into it. They're doing very well because they're understanding how to do it, and they have no problem paying this tax. But in any event, because it's tiny in comparison to what they make. But in my own 401k plan, and I'm all for paying the tax, it would cost me $50 in a year. It's not significant. But let's go. I want to address a couple arguments that Mr. Friedfeld made. One is this idea that we're going to cut state aid to the wealthy schools. Now, in my district, I remember I took the speaker on a tour of my district, and we were driving along, going to General Electric R&D, which is in my district. And on the right was this beautiful building with manicured lawns. And the speaker says to me, "What's that?" I said, "That's the Niskayuna School District. It's one of the best school districts in the nation." Now, by Mr. Friedfeld's argument, that's a district that should lose state funding. However, the Niskayuna School District, because Niskayuna is a very residential community, they don't have a lot of property available for taxing, and GE can't be taxed at its highest rate because, quite frankly, Mr. Friedfeld, GE would move because that's the way real property taxes work as opposed to a sales tax. That district is laying off teachers on a massive scale. It is not benefiting from huge amounts of state aid as proposed. Meanwhile, next door is Schenectady, which is owed billions of dollars if you apply the state foundation aid formula. I have said many times in my district that the solution to Schenectady's problems is not causing Niskayuna to fail. The solution to Schenectady's problems is indeed to fully fund the foundation aid formula. You cannot do that without appropriate revenue raising. So if you're serious about school aid, the argument just doesn't cut it. A lot of the places where some of that school aid goes are in places which have extremely high property taxes and where a lot of middle-class people live. So to increase those taxes more would be crushingly burdensome on those people. On the bonding issue, of course, everyone understands that bonding for capital projects is correct. But if you go to the governor's state of the state every year, you will see these beautiful, grandiose projects, all of which we are made to believe are actually happening. They aren't. What happens is they're rolled out every year as to what the governor would like to do if he had the money. Yes, some of them are happening. But you can't bond everything because the state has debt limits, and New York, compared to a lot of other states, is in decent shape with respect to its bonding capacity versus its actual outstanding bonds. So the idea that you can just bond for everything, in a vacuum, it works. But in reality, when you've already got a state infrastructure that is derated and you've got tremendous amounts of needs, it's not realistic. Also, local government, if he starts cutting local government, you're going to have big problems, because even in my wealthier towns, they can barely pave the roads. Now, why is this? It is because prior to the tremendous explosion of defense spending that we had, the federal government used to provide a lot of aid for roads and water and sewer, especially in the area of water and sewer, where all our systems were built with federal dollars. No such dollars anymore. So when that happens, when that tax burden is now shifted down to state, the state has two choices. It could raise taxes, which one would be unpopular because most of it would tax the middle class, and Mr. Friedfeld would not support that. Or it can do something else. It can let the infrastructure go to hell. And that's what it's done.
Well,
So
on that issue of the infrastructure going to hell, I'm going to let Mr. Kink come in here. Who's got, now you got to get us out of hell, sir.
I'll get us out of hell by taking us to a more global perspective. You know, let's come back to New York having a $1.7 trillion economy. New York, as much as the Wall Street lobbyists at the CBC would like us to think, is not in competition with Oklahoma or Miami or Dallas, Texas. New York is in competition with Hong Kong and London, and that is about it. You know, a little bit of Shanghai, a little bit of Paris, but we are a global center of wealth. The Tisch family lives in New York, and they're a huge freaking deal in New York. They sit on the boards, they go to the museums, right? Paul Singer, the hedge fund trader on Park Avenue, can live anywhere else in the world he wants to live. He lives in New York. New York is a global center of wealth and power, and of speculation and stock trading. That is not going to move. It's not going to move because of the telephone. It's not going to move because of computers. The money and the smarts and the concentrated wealth that our state has is bigger than anywhere else in the country. Literally big. We have more billionaires than anywhere else in the country. California has its own like things going on in San Francisco and Los Angeles, both of which have local taxes. But New York is a global power center of wealth, and we can and should act that way. This tax, the stock transfer tax, is a tiny, tiny little percentage in the larger economy of New York. The lobbyists for Wall Street have been telling us since 1905 that a tiny tax on their trades is going to devastate their industry and they're going to run away, and they're just not. This is smoke and mirrors. We have decisions to make in New York. We need to ask the wealthy to pay more. The percentages that we're asking them to pay in any of these bills that you and your colleagues have introduced in Albany are not confiscatory tax rates. They're not like, give us all your money and go walking down the street with a barrel over you instead of clothes. That is not any of these policies. And so the incredible amounts of smoke and lobbying that has been stirred up around these mainstream tax proposals that basically would take us closer to where we were in the Nelson Rockefeller era in the 60s, you know, none of these things are going to hurt our economy. They're only going to help our economy. They're going to create jobs. They're going to create investments. They're going to create a future for our children. And they're going to create a real opportunity to address the racial inequities, the social inequities, the profound inequality we have in our state. It's worse than anywhere in the country. And we've been letting these Wall Street guys basically run the policy since the Pataki era. You know, David and his colleagues have basically been in charge. They've been the ones that have been pushing the austerity. Pataki went along with them. Cuomo went along with them. David Patterson went along with them. It is time for a new era where the people are in charge instead of Wall Street. And that's what we can begin to do with a significant revenue package that shows the state what we can do with investments. You know, one of the problems we've had is that people are pissed off at government services because they're inadequate. There are too many places where the subways aren't good enough and the roads aren't good enough. And that's because of the recommendations of groups like the Citizens Budget Commission, like the Empire Center. They've been saying, cut all the stuff in the state, just give all the money to the rich people, and that is not going to work. That's
Well,
not.
I'm going to have him answer that in a moment. And he's got to look in those smoke and mirrors that you said that are there, and perhaps he will see himself, or perhaps he won't see himself in those mirrors, because I'm going to let him explain, and this will also be his closing statement. So I'm sure he may smash me over the head with those smoke and mirrors, or metaphorically, of course. Mr. Friedfeld.
I like the idea of kind of taking the global perspective. I think that if a tax like this were to be levied at the national level, I think, and I've seen some, ideas about levying on a national level and having revenues, return to the state where the transaction occurred. I think that would be a very different conversation, and I don't think you'd see the likelihood of firms leaving. As far as New York's dominance in this sphere, like I said before, we are dominant, but we're not as dominant as we used to be. I mean, it's not, we're not guaranteed for forever to be the best at this. Is regarding the bond cap, which Assemblyman Steck had mentioned, the budget, as I'm sure you know, the budget that you passed this past spring exempts the state from the bond cap this year, given the financial straits that the state is in. So it actually wouldn't be an issue on bonding. And for the economic development proposals, CBC has long been a critic, we'll say, of the governor's approach to economic development, particularly these attempts at silver bullets to revive an entire region by investing billions of dollars in, let's say, a Solar City factory in Western New York. So I think those are some of the important points. I think that taxes and financial incentives matter, and I'm not saying that all these wealthy New Yorkers who made their money on Wall Street are suddenly going to flee New York and move away. But one thing that we've seen, and I worked in the Assembly for 8 years. When I left, I was the tax deputy for Ways and Means Committee. I oversaw the Assembly's revenue forecasting and tax policy shop. People respond to taxes. They just do. They're apt to leave and find ways to avoid taxes when they can. And I think that's something that the state needs to be really cognizant of when creating, or if they choose to move forward with this policy, because I kind of see two potential impacts. One is that the tax is created in such a way that people cannot avoid it. If they're in New York, they're going to be forced to pay the tax. If they live here, if they work here, if the trade in any way is associated with New York, it's going to be taxable. And I fear that if that's the case, it will have negative economic impacts. And I think if it's done in a more loose way, where it's easier to avoid, then the state is going to expect to get, let's say, $5 billion, and is going to get $1 billion. And then you have a huge hole in the state's budget, which creates long-term problems for all New Yorkers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kink. You got your 60 seconds right before Assemblyman Steck brings on his 60 seconds. Bring it on home. What do you want the people to take away from this?
Thank you, Senator, and thanks to everybody for the good conversation today. The people that move in response to small changes in marginal tax rates are working people, poor people, retirees. The actual migration of rich people is tiny. We have 92% more millionaires than when we started the millionaires tax. The academic studies show that people live where they can work and do business and get rich when you're talking about rich people. And we have tons of rich people. They are getting so rich living here. A small tax on their stock trades, a modest tax on their income, an appropriate tax on their unrealized capital gains, to make sure that we're not cutting hundreds of thousands of jobs in a recession, to build back after COVID with justice so that we're rebuilding our health system. We're getting people out of homeless shelters and into safe, affordable apartments. We're investing in education equity and making sure we close the achievement gap. Those are all things we can do if we ask the rich to pay their fair share. And there was a time in New York when rich people were happy to do that. They recognize their responsibility.
May that time be returned to us. Mr. Steck, you've got your 60 seconds to bring it on home, what do you want the people to know?
Well, I think that couple things were very interesting in Mr. Friedfeld's closing arguments. Number one, I think he exploded his own argument on bonding because he's relying on making the bonding capacity excessive because of COVID. That's not a sensible way to run a state. We are not the federal government. We cannot print money. We have to raise it. The second point that I wanted to make is all of these considerations that were referred to about people moving and the consequences of taxes, all of these have been considered. It's a cost-benefit economic analysis. And it's not just a bunch of legislators who want to spend money on wild projects. It is a serious endeavor. We had the panel discussion. I think all of these issues were appropriately handled by expert economists. So I would close with the one thing I let out, which is that Mr. Friedfeld's job is to create fear. Roosevelt said, all we have to fear is fear itself. They want the federal tax, they say, because they think they have an easier opportunity to defeat it at the federal level with all some of those crazies down there in Washington who believe in these QAnon theories or what have you. So we need to return to basic principles of macroeconomics, which were enunciated by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, currently represented by Joseph Stiglitz at the worldwide level, Nobel Prize winning economist who spoke in favor of this. And I think that when you look at all these arguments, they really don't have significant weight.
Well, I fear, Assemblyman, that the thing that I fear the most is that time is not our friend. I will say this. I will say that without any fear, I really thank you all for presenting your cases well. I think that this is an example of the high level of thinking that we should do on any issue. We should just not sweep stuff under the rug. There are very important things that people have to deal with. To the people of New York, you ultimately will decide this issue. You need to weigh in. If you believe that Mr. Friedfeld makes sense, call his office and make sure that he gets the support. Same to Mr. Kink, same to Mr. Steck, same to myself. Call, participate. One way of participating is, of course, on November the 3rd. There is an election. Who you vote for is up to you. If you ask me my opinion, I would tell you to vote for yes, but I didn't. So under those conditions, Bernie's not running. Don't worry about it.
Oh boy.
So my cousin Bernie is not running right now, maybe the next one. So under those conditions, my friends, I really want to thank the guests. I want to thank my staff for helping put this together. Khadija and, of course, Ivan have done an admirable job, aided by Paul. I want to thank Senate Services. We really could not do this without Senate Services. On the next time we do this, you'll love this one. We're going to look at the issue of reparations. We're really going to get deep into this, but we're going to look at it from both sides. We're going to see who has difficulties with the idea, and we're going to put those things out. If an idea is not good enough to stand on its own feet, we shouldn't do it. If it can't pass the muster of common sense and economic ability, then we shouldn't do it. Here we deal with no fuzzy thinking. We're going to encourage people to call in. Therefore, we're not screening. There will be no fuzzy thinking, not even when we discuss the issue of cannabis. No, there will be no free samples. We will discuss cannabis. We will discuss all of these things. No fuzzy thinking here, because this show is called Let's Be Clear, and I am State Senator James Sanders Jr., and I have beat the clock with 20 seconds to spare. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Got it.
Really now the rain is gone.